Graphics don't matter. That is the motto of every hardcore Nintendo fan, and to an extent, it is true. You don't bash Super Mario 64 because of the polygons, you appreciate the hell out of it because it's Super Mario 64. Although here's the thing, I don't think the gameplay of that game is aged too particularly well either. The controls kind of suck, but that is mostly just me. Most people love that game, so, you know. But while gameplay is definitely the number one priority, if a game isn't fun, then I don't want to play it. I don't care how good the visuals look. Visuals are nice though, you know, it is nice to have something that's good to look at while you're playing your game, instead of just guy with sphere head and other sphere. And as we all know, the Switch's hardware is incredibly outdated. It's a handheld system from 2017. And that is the main reason that we all want the Switch 2. I mean, you know, other options and possibilities could be nice, like getting the 3D slider from the 3DS onto the Switch 2, that might be fun. And then the Joy-Cons could also use vastly improved motion controls. Their gyro is kinda eh. And then there is a certain little problem that we all know as Joy-Con drift that needs to be fixed. But the main reason we all want the successor system is the graphics. When we get the Switch 2, it needs to be able to run most games at 60 FPS 1080p in handheld mode with upscaling while docked. And if other big AAA studios want to put their games on the Switch 2, then they should be able to do so with relative ease, and they shouldn't have to cheese grate the crap out of it to make it fit on the underpowered hardware. It should be reasonable to be able to fit those games on the system. And they should be able to run well while they are on it. But here's the thing. While other studios should be able to fit their big graphical powerhouses on the Switch 2, and while all games should be able to have high resolutions and frame rates, I don't think Nintendo should put much more visual effort into their first-party games outside of that than they already are. Now, I know what you're thinking. Calvin, what the heck are you talking about? You want your Nintendo games to look worse? Look at how good all the other AAA games look nowadays, and you want them to look like this forever? And my answer to that is yes and no. Let me explain. So with these big, epic, brand new systems, just because the hardware can now handle better visuals doesn't mean that those better visuals are now easier to make. The graphical improvements between generations nowadays are minuscule compared to how the GameCube improved over the N64, for example. And yet, these new graphics are leagues more difficult to make than they were just a few generations ago. The difficulties of making these hyper-realistic graphics are handled through vastly longer budgets and ridiculously long development times. All for only a slight improvement in visuals compared to what we got like a couple generations ago. And these exponentially better graphics don't translate to exponentially higher sales numbers, meaning these companies will have to make up the costs through microtransactions, more expensive games, other methods of squeezing more money out of customers like subscriptions and advertisements, and laying off staff. And by the way, that staff will be hella overworked to be able to make all this stuff for these big new epic games. Now, let's look at some first-party Switch games to compare. Aside from the bad resolution and frame rates, many Nintendo games look pretty damn good. And the games having stylization over realism is already part of Nintendo's brand, meaning it won't make much sense for them to dive into hyper-realism anyways. And plus, it also makes their games stand out a lot more. Because, let's be real, all this realistic stuff, it really all looks the same. Games like Super Mario Odyssey, Pikmin 4, Metroid Prime Remastered, Metroid Dread. These are all games that look incredible. The only issues they ever really have is, like, running issues, which even, like, for these games specifically, that's already pretty minuscule. But on the new hardware, they wouldn't really have to worry about that. There's, like, just a few tweaks they'd have to make. A few things to make them look more modern to properly take advantage of the hardware, and then they're good. These games already look great. And that's just some of Nintendo's more realistic stuff. There's also plenty of Switch games that look great from an artistic perspective, like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, the Splatoon games, Kirby and the Forgotten Land, Luigi's Mansion 3, the Xenoblade games. Sure, there's also a lot of Nintendo Switch games that look like trash, but I feel like the stronger hardware would manage to get these games to get off their ass in terms of graphics. Because really, other than just resolution and frame rate, there's only a few issues that these games have visually aside from that, and those can be fixed pretty easily. Some Switch games have models where if you look at them from a side perspective, so you can't see the model blending, you can tell that they don't have the highest polygon counts. But that's an easy fix on stronger hardware like a Switch 2. They don't enter in all these polygons manually. There's a setting on most 3D modeling softwares that allow you to just turn up and down the polygon counts on curvature in the models. So in order to make these have higher polygon counts, they just need to like turn it up on their software a bit. That's like a minuscule amount of effort for them. Probably less effort actually, because now they don't have to worry about keeping away from any sort of polygon cap anymore. Then there's a bit of a more glaring issue that would be a bit more difficult to fix. Painted on textures. You'll notice with stuff like walls, floors, dirt, platooning, gloom, it all has a sort of painted on feel to the textures. Like, these textures aren't really texture in the sense of real life texture, where they're on top of the object. They're literally just images that are painted onto the models. And because of that, there's not really any sort of depth to a lot of surfaces in Nintendo games. But this can also be fixed, I mean, not easily, but you don't have to put a PS5 game level of effort into making it good. Just do sort of like a layering system. Just add like a few extra layers of texture layered over the first layer of textures that's painted onto the surface. And that can add depth to stuff like dirt, tree bark, rock textures, and all sorts of other stuff. Stuff like platoon paint and gloom can just be layered over the ground, and then you've got some depth to your textures, and it's no longer obviously just painted on. Now, this definitely wouldn't be easy. It would take a lot more work than what they're already doing in most cases, but it is still an efficient and cost-effective way to make the textures in these games have a sense of depth. Then there's other stuff like cracks in walls in Super Mario Odyssey just being painted onto the textures as well, and those cracks would just have to be filled in manually on the Switch 2 games, and I feel like it would be worth it. I feel like having real cracks would be great for immersion. And then, with those slight issues on how to make these games look slightly better cleared out, these games should look visually great, assuming they still put effort into the visuals, like with Mario Odyssey and Pikmin 4, and don't just phone it in like with Pokemon, or some of these other games. Nintendo can do all of this, and their games will look absolutely awesome, all without taking forever to make and costing more money than the game's worth. If you haven't noticed, a lot of the AAA games industry is going through a bit of a dark age. Games are costing more, and companies are trying to use cheap tactics to milk us for all we're worth in order to make up for that cost. There's also a bunch of other problems going on, actually, like, so many problems, but it's not pretty when it comes to big releases. But by maintaining their graphical course with some simple upgrades, Nintendo can avoid entering this dark age along with everyone else. And we can still get reasonably priced first-party game releases coming out at a pretty good frequency, I think. Quality over quantity is important, but Nintendo delivers plenty of quality outside of graphics, and it's not necessarily a bad thing to sacrifice a tiny amount of quality for far greater quantity, especially if avoiding gaining that tiny amount of quality can help avoid a great number of other pitfalls besides a low quantity. And the quality can still look great in its own right. I don't want Nintendo to stretch themselves too thin trying to catch up with the rest of the industry graphically. Their games already look great, and they also already take quite a long time. 6 years between Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom? Seriously. We're getting lots of awesome big Nintendo games nowadays, and I don't want to lose that just for some slightly better graphics that are super realistic and super detailed. I'm fine with how Pikmin 4 looks, it just needs a few slight improvements. And it definitely won't be worth it for Nintendo to try and gain that graphical perfection at the cost of overworking their staff and blowing out a lot of money that they can't afford to blow out. Especially since, once again, let's be real, these realistic games all look very, very similar to each other. And I am really thankful that Nintendo's games are almost definitely going to keep their individual styles, due to each game having their own established image of having that style that isn't going away anytime soon regardless of graphical jump. Let's be real, can you really see Mario looking super hyper-realistic as if it was, I don't know, the next Call of Duty game or something? No, that doesn't really fit Mario's bill. And I'm thankful it doesn't, because that means we get to have stuff that looks like this. Fun, unique, and still really visually great, especially with the Switch 2's added hardware. And not like... bleh. But feel free to tell me what you guys think down in the comments. I might be crazy. I probably am. Actually, no, I am crazy. The question is, am I crazy about this? Feel free to tell me.